Something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
I reported that it was the saddest crowd that would ever assemble.
A scene of indescribable sadness and horror.
Mrs. Kennedy would not change clothes. She said, I want them to see what they have done to him.
And that is a portion of an upcoming CBS one-hour special to mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. 48 Hours presents As It Happened. John F. Kennedy, 50 years, takes us back to those tragic days. CBS News Chief Washington correspondent and anchor of Face the Nation, Bob Schieffer, takes viewers inside the 4 days that changed America.
And Bob joins us now from Washington, D.C. Bob, good to see you. Welcome to Live at 5.
I think the last time I saw you was at the Rose Bowl when TCU played Wisconsin.
That's right. It's always good to see you. But here is the question that everybody, so many people ask themselves. Where were you, Bob, on November 22nd, 1963?
Well, it's not hard for me to remember. I was not assigned to cover that story. I worked at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in those days, and I was just on the city desk after the president was shot, trying to help answer the phones. It was complete bedlam. A woman calls in and says, is there anybody there that can give me a ride to Dallas? And I said, lady, and I almost hung up the phone. I said, you know, we're not running a taxi here, and besides, the president's been shot. And she said, yes, I heard it on the radio. I think my son is the one they've arrested. And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And we wrote down her address, and another reporter and I went out to her home on the west side of Fort Worth. She was standing out on the curb when we got there, and we actually drove her to Dallas, and I interviewed her on the way. It was just one of those flukes, but I guess that's how you get good stories most of the time, if you're just in the right place in the right time.
What in the world did you talk to her about?
Well, I just asked her about it. She was a very peculiar person. I mean, the president hadn't been dead 2 hours, and she started talking about herself, how people would give Oswald's wife money, and they wouldn't remember the mother, and she'd starve to death, and she was totally obsessed with money. I later concluded that she was a deranged person and really kind of the bad person in all of this. Some of the things she said were so bizarre that I didn't even put them in the story. I thought, well, how would you feel if your son had just been arrested for shooting the president? It probably should have, because it would have given us a better picture early of just who Lee Harvey Oswald was and how he kind of turned out to be the way he did.
Well, it was such a different time, and I think for people of this generation, it's hard to comprehend how this story gripped the nation. You described it as the weekend that America lost its innocence, and it truly was.
I really do believe that, Susan. And you have to understand, we didn't know what this meant. Nothing like this had ever happened before, one of these violent events. We were deep into the Cold War. We were a year away from the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't know if this was the beginning of World War III. We simply didn't know what this was. And then suddenly this thing that nobody could imagine happened. I mean, you know, up until that point, we kind of all believed in our leaders. We believed in our institutions. We took so many things for granted. But this was the beginning of a decade when Americans began to question everything, not just our leaders, but our institutions. And we would have other assassinations to come after this. But this was the first of those events. I truly do think it changed America.
And it certainly changed the way America received its news.
Well, it really did, because, you know, up until that point, most Americans got their news in print. They didn't really believe things, so they saw it written down in black and white. But that weekend, the entire nation focused on one story at one time. I think it had an impact on the national psyche. It was like we all had gone to the same funeral. And from that weekend on, television became the place where most people got their news, and it remained that way up until the coming of the internet.
We are certainly looking for your broadcast on Saturday evening, Bob. Thanks for being with us today on Live at 5.
So good to see you, Bob. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Susan.